Okay, so yeah, this is about our food systems and climate change, and well, should we be worried? And then kind of taking it back to like, what can we do locally? Because I guess some of the things we talk about at the start might feel quite big and global and a bit out of control. I just wanted to start a little bit because I'm going to talk about the food system. I just wanted to give a bit of an introduction to that, and this is a diagram that kind of shows a lot of different elements of how the environmental, the economic, the social, political, all interact kind of with our farming system. It's not just about food production. There's lots of other kind of drivers driving kind of where we are now. And as we all need to eat, we kind of rely on this series of relationships to keep us and our families well fed. And how our food is grown and distributed and shared, exchanged, eaten, wasted and composted, or whatever else we do with it at the end of its life, has a huge impact on human health, but also our environmental health and the health of our ecosystems. And so this figure shows kind of a lot of those interactions. And it's also important to say at this stage, there's lots of other food systems globally, and there's not just one food system or one type of food system. But in the UK, we really have a system that's dominated by more industrial scale agriculture, and it's strongly driven by particular economics and politics, linked quite often to large and global kind of multinational organizations and food companies. And this has led to really long and complex supply chains, and it's increasing kind of disconnection between people who produce food and people that buy it and consume it, and actually a lot less control for both ends of that spectrum, from the producers to the consumers. And the focus on kind of economics of large scale and efficiency has driven down the cost of food. So food is potentially much cheaper now than it used to be in terms of the proportion that people spend. But it's come at other costs, and this can be really hard to see it when you buy food in a supermarket, which is where a lot of people do buy their food. And some of these costs include like the money that's spent cleaning up pollution incidences, the species that we're lost to deforestation, the public health costs that are linked to really poor and nutrient poor diets, and the stress on producers that work long hours and often accumulate quite large debts. And sometimes when you look at this diagram, it can feel quite overwhelming because these drivers, this economic, political and social drivers, have a very strong influence, and they're also working at a global scale. So what we're hoping with this talk, and then more so with Anna's talk afterwards, is that we can have discuss these big issues, but then focus on kind of what can we do here locally, and what decisions can we make personally and as a community to actually react and respond to the challenges of the climate emergency. So here is kind of a bit of an overview of the climate impacts of our food system. So between 20 to 30% of our global climate carbon emissions are associated with food and the food production of food. And it gets the higher numbers and the higher range of numbers associated kind of with the land use change that comes with food production. And the major impacts, or the major kind of climate impacts, come within the production stage. So the kind of the green side of this on this diagram. So this here says around 15 to 25% of global greenhouse gases are associated with kind of the inputs we put into farming, their production, the impacts they have themselves on the soil, so things like fertilizers, manures and pesticides, the land use change, so this can be things such as deforestation, particularly like where that's rapidly happening for some kind of cash crops in certain parts of the world, and then also emissions that come directly from livestock as well. And then the stages in red, which are kind of the later in the supply chain, it's like packaging, retail, transport, processing and food preparation, and then also kind of the greenhouse gas emissions and energy use associated with cooking and preparation, and then with waste itself and waste disposal. There are a smaller proportion of the overall greenhouse gas emissions associated with food. So the production side is where a lot of focus can happen. A lot of the proportion of greenhouse gas emissions are at the moment, but the greenhouse gas emissions associated with this kind of this processing element and the stuff in red they are increasing because as we get more complex supply chains and we do more food processing, we actually have more emissions kind of being associated with that production side. It's also really important to remember that there's other impacts that the food system is having on our ecosystems. So 70% of all extracted fresh water is used for irrigating farms. And this often is happening in countries that are most at risk of drought, when we then export stuff to the UK. Agriculture is the most significant cause of deforestation globally, and that's linked to huge biodiversity loss. And intensive agriculture is generating huge kind of excessive amounts of nutrients, which are then lost to the air and water. And they in turn are actually creating feedbacks to the climate. So nutrients that are lost to water often end up in the ocean. It's driving ocean acidification, which in turn destroys kind of ocean ecosystems, which are responsible for absorbing carbon dioxide. So you can see we have some kind of really critical cycles other than just carbon to focus on when we look at agriculture and our food system. And then we also have the risks that climate poses to our food system. So we've got these extremes, the climate-driven extremes of weather, which we're already seeing. So these can be things like drought, flooding, and changing kind of seasonal patterns, that growing seasons are no longer quite as they used to be. And recently researchers have reported that damage to crops from heat waves and droughts has tripled in Europe over the past 50 years already. And we're already kind of experiencing disrupted weather patterns here in Lancashire. We have these long spring droughts. We have these very low water conditions now in the local reservoirs. I don't know if anyone's been up to the lakes recently and seen Thelmere, but it's like half, it looks like it's half empty. These industrial food systems as well kind of have eroded our crop and livestock diversity. And this means that we're kind of being more and more vulnerable to pests and diseases, which are more and more likely to occur under climate change conditions. And this figure here kind of shows our genetic diversity. So we've lost a lot of genetic diversity in our crop types and in the crop varieties within each crop over the past century. Here, kind of at the top of the mushroom, there's that's the diversity we had kind of over a century ago in commercial seed houses, and you can see how much that's shrunk. And this is actually by 1983, so not even up to the present. And this genetic diversity is really important to enabling us in future to be able to adapt to whatever challenges come up, whether it be pests and diseases or whether it be changing kind of climate. We've also created really long supply chains that are really vulnerable to disruption, and the pandemic kind of showed that. These kind of disruptions, whether it's climate disruption or geopolitical disruptions, will become more likely as the kind of climate becomes more unstable. The UK has a really high water footprint imports, and so I mentioned this earlier, but around 76% of the fresh water that's consumed in fresh fruit and vegetables is actually withdrawn overseas, and a lot of it comes from countries that are already experiencing drought and water risks. And even kind of thinking about what comes from Spain and the kind of situation they have with water there and how much of our food is coming from Spain, it's really important to kind of consider that pressure we're putting on other places. And then finally, food is really essential for societal cohesion. And a lot of like the uprisings and riots that have happened in recent years have been linked back to climate change effects that have already happened to impact on the food system. And kind of pressure on society will become increasingly relevant. So that's quite, it feels quite sobering. But I just wanted to talk now about a few different things that we can try and do locally and personally. Oh, sorry, something's just appeared. That's okay. So yeah, I'm going to start with diets, and this is something obviously we can discuss like when we have the questions at the end, because we want to think about kind of what this means for us locally, but and what it means globally. But there's been a lot of work done, and this around diets and the effect of kind of particularly high livestock based diets, so dairy and meat consumption, and the high kind of carbon impact these have. And this is a graphic that's been pulled from the Lancet report, which is a report from 2019 brought together by a whole range of scientists working across the environment, agriculture, and also the human health. And they showed the greenhouse gas emissions associated with different food sources. And they also show, so the dot is the mean for the global mean, and then that the line kind of going horizontal line shows the range, because there is a whole range of different ways that meat, dairy, soy, fruit, vegetables, nuts are produced, and therefore there's not one figure that accounts for all of that type of food. But it shows quite clearly that the greenhouse gas emissions and the land use and the energy use associated with meat consumption and dairy to an extent is a lot higher than if you have a predominantly plant-based diet, or you're looking at predominantly plant-based food sources. And it's important here actually to notice that it's the amount of food, so it's 28 grams of that, so it's not protein, so it's not directly transferable. So that's one thing to keep in mind with the graph here. But then if you move on to looking at kind of direct comparisons of protein intake, if you look at animal protein sources compared to plant-based protein sources, so on the left is animal-based and on the right is plant-based, you can see that for the same amount of protein, the greenhouse gas emissions are a lot higher for animal-based sources of proteins than plant-based, and the same for land area. So what does this mean in terms of diet? Well, there's a big difference between if you're a high meat eater and if you're a vegan. You can more than half the greenhouse gas emissions associated with your diet. However, there's a whole range of types of meat that people eat and different types of diets that people have. So you can see that if people can reduce from high to low, or can think about cutting out meat for certain meals of the week, you can get huge reductions in your greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to think about what that means locally. Kind of livestock dominated region. As FoodFutures, like what is our way of kind of thinking about this going forwards? And we really like the idea of less but better meat, and encouraging people. Like lots of people will choose not to eat meat, and other people will choose probably to continue eating meat the same. But the facts are quite stark that we can't continue to all eat meat at the level that we in the Western world eat meat. We need people to eat less meat and dairy, and therefore taking this approach of eating less but better, and thinking about where you buy it from, and thinking about buying it from producers that produce meat and dairy that are ways that are good for the environment, not just for carbon but actually for biodiversity, for soil health, is really important. And we can come back and discuss that maybe at the end. And then thinking as well, this is another really simple kind of aspect that we need to look at, is waste. And this is both personal, like what we do as individuals, what we waste as individuals once we bought food, but also the supply chain. So an average UK individual wastes around 1.3 kilograms of food a week. And there's obviously the emissions that come when that goes to the landfill, or if it gets incinerated or digested. But there's also the emissions that are embodied in that food. So all the emissions that have gone into producing that food. So the amount of food that an average person wastes is around equivalent to 2 days of food in a vegan diet, or the emissions for 1/5 of the cars that are on our roads. So it's a substantial amount of carbon there that we could save by just not wasting as much. And there's also supply chain losses to think about, and shorter supply chains and more direct supply chains can help mitigate some of that supply chain loss that you get at a large scale. And it's also important to think about what we do with the waste that's left. So this is like the idea that we can return organic matter to the soil and build up carbon in the soil through composting. And then it's another kind of thing to think about is eating with the seasons. So the use of the fossil fuel that we use to heat glass houses to grow certain things in the UK or in the Netherlands in the winter has a much higher greenhouse gas impact than transport costs. And this graph here kind of shows that if you grow lettuce inside in the UK in the winter, and then compared to if you just transport it in the green there from Spain, the emissions are far less by growing something in Spain and transporting it here in the winter, but about the same if you do it in the summer and grow stuff outside. So thinking about what you're buying and when you're buying it is really important. And the transport costs, the transport kind of emissions are much lower than people actually think that they are. It does really depend on the transport type. So air freighted produce has a really high climate impact. So stuff that you see that needs to be kept chilled will have to have arrived very quickly to be with you, like asparagus from Peru will most certainly have been air freighted, and that has huge emissions. And then there's this thing about, if we eat with the seasons, then we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are related to both production and transport. And it also kind of brings up the ethical issue of the water scarcity, and bringing water from places in the winter just because it's good for the carbon emissions doesn't mean it's actually the right thing to do, because you're taking water from a water scarce place. So really it's the idea that we think more about what we can grow here and eat kind of with the seasons of what we can grow here, and think about what grows in other places that makes sense to kind of bring here through with low transport emissions. And there's this idea of how the food is produced, and this has a really important climate impact. So, and it's not just about climate really, it's also about biodiversity and about kind of our whole like ecosystem health. And we really kind of encourage people to support agroecological producers. And these are farming systems that are more likely to be designed, or will be designed around ecology, and they're much more likely to build back our ecosystems, to regenerate ecosystems, whether this be the soil, the water, or the kind of wider landscape and the biodiversity in that. It won't rely on artificial inputs such as fertilizers and pesticides, and these have destabilizing kind of impacts on the Earth's cycles, including the climate. There's a growing kind of field of evidence to suggest that these systems will build back soil carbon and other land stores of carbon and increase biodiversity. And it's also often quite often smaller scale, and it's quite often adapted to its place. And this helps kind of encourage diversity, and it also encourages resilience, because it means that you're kind of adapting your growing to fit, adapting your food production to fit kind of with the place that you are and the challenges that that place might bring. And it's actually being recognised at a national and international level as kind of the way that we're going to manage to shift farming systems and food production systems to become more sustainable and more kind of fair as well, and kind of more owned by people rather than just owned by multinational companies. Oh, I think needs to go off. Needs to mute. Sorry, thank you. And then there's this idea about building resilience as well, because it's not just about trying to reduce the impact that I guess we have on the climate, but it's also preparing for the changes that are already happening, preparing our resilience to that. And these are things, I'm going to go through a few things here, but diversity really is key. And this is genetic diversity, so this is in the seeds, and keeping that kind of diversity of material and seeds there, and traits that crops have that enable us to select and change, kind of adapt to the changes that are coming our way. It's also about diversity in what we're growing and in produce, and trying to reduce the reliance on having monocultures in certain places, but actually having a wide variety of products available, so that if something fails, or if something is destroyed in one area, we have lots of other options to fall back on. It's also about diversity of people. So I've included here, like, this is Spud Club here at Claver Hill, so it's like community food growing, and then this is Kath Grayson, I think you're on the call, the Morecambe Bay Conservation Grazers, and it's just bringing in a diversity of skills and knowledge and approaches and different ways of producing food, really, really key. And then scales, and I haven't got a picture for this because there's two kinds of scales. I guess it's talking about kind of the scale that we're growing at. A lot of our farming now is really large scale, but thinking about smaller scale, kind of different ways that different scales can enable you to adapt in different ways. A lot of our kind of mechanized farming systems will find it really hard to adapt to very different kind of conditions in the fields, like flooding and drought, and they're quite committed to those ways forward. So having a different scales of farming could be really valuable in our ability to adapt. And then there's also scales of where we're getting food from, and kind of the local and global and length of our supply chains. So we have these long industrialized supply chains, and they're vulnerable to lots of shocks, and they also have introduced lots of complexity, as we would have seen with this carbon dioxide crisis. I had no idea how much, one, we were relied on the fertilizer industry to provide CO2, but actually how much CO2 is used in various things in the food system. And we've introduced all these different layers of complexity that mean that food might not get to people and will instead be wasted. And the pandemic highlighted this as well. And I guess we're not saying that all food needs to be produced locally. And there are also, if you talk about resilience, some people will say there's resilience in having different places around the world or different places around the UK have producing lots of food, so that you're able, if one place suffers a major shock, like food can be coming from different places. But at the moment, the UK food system really focuses solely on trade, and it's been shown to be extremely vulnerable. And there's a really good book by Tim Lang down in City University about just how insecure our food supply is and how many days of food the UK has. And this local and direct supply also really is important because it builds a connection between the producers and the eaters. It cuts out lots of layers of complexity and also lots of layers of additional kind of control, and enables people to see where their food is coming from and maybe care more about where it's coming from, and actually be able to relate kind of what they're eating to how it was produced and what they might want to, how they might want to see it produced. It creates new ways of distributing food more equitably, and it also creates kind of more localized and innovative ways of dealing with surplus, and hopefully connects people that have surplus up with people that might want to use surplus. So there's lots of kind of ways here that we can kind of tackle some of the climate issues around waste, and people's food choices, but also making us more resilient as well. And then, yeah, just finishing here with a picture of Claver Hill. So it's Spud Club once again, but this is a whole Claver Hill food growing project. So this is community food growing. And these spaces are going to be really important as well as places where people can learn food growing skills. It helps to increase our own resilience. Lots of people joined up Claver Hill, and also lots of other allotments and community food projects around the UK in response to seeing empty shelves in the supermarket and wanting to have a bit more control over where their food was coming from and wanting to learn some skills of how to do it themselves. Research also shows that people that are involved in food growing or that get involved with food growing actually end up taking more sustainable choices as well in other aspects of their life, including kind of their diet, their travel choices, and their waste and consumption patterns. And then it also just builds community. It connects us better, and gives us the ability to support each other as we're facing these kind of really uncertain times. And it looks really beautiful as well.